You wouldn't believe it if I told you, but last spring, I woke up to find a brand new fence splitting my orchard in two. Not just any fence, mind you. A towering iron-barred monstrosity, dark and cold-looking, like something you'd see around a prison or a museum that thinks it's too good for the people walking past. Right there, cutting a clean, arrogant line through the middle of my orchard. I blinked twice, rubbed my eyes, opened the back door in my slippers, and stepped out onto the damp grass, half expecting I was dreaming. I wasn't. The early morning. Light painted everything with that soft golden haze, except this ugly fence that cast long, jagged shadows over my trees like a scar. There was even a little plaque bolted into one of the central posts, like it was proud of itself. It read, "Property. Line adjusted by HOA approval." Just like that. No warning, no call. Not even a letter stuffed into my mailbox with that irritating HOA letterhead. For a moment, I just stood there, jaw clenched, breath fogging in the morning chill. I knew something was wrong, deeply wrong. But my brain was still catching up with what my eyes were seeing. My orchard, my grandfather's orchard. The land I'd grown up running through barefoot, the same land I'd poured sweat into every spring, the same trees I'd trimmed and watched bloom every single year, was now bisected by a fence someone else decided belonged there. Half my trees stood on one side. The other half, the ones closest to the street, were now beyond the reach of my boots. Technically, legally, mine. But the fence didn't care. And neither did the HOA. Now don't get me wrong, I'm not one of those guys who hates rules. I joined the neighborhood knowing it had an HOA, and for the most part, we coexisted peacefully. I paid my dues. I showed up at a few meetings. I even planted native shrubs out front like they asked in last year's newsletter. But I always figured there was a line between what they handled, paint colors, trash bins, street parking, and the land that was mine. You know, the kind of line you'd need a judge, a surveyor, and probably a few lawyers to redraw. Apparently, I figured wrong. By the time the coffee had finished brewing inside, I was on the phone. They gave me the runaround, of course. Said the board had voted on it, that there had been ample notice, that it was all in the community's best interest. I asked them how it could possibly be in the community's best interest to split my orchard in half. Their answer? An archival oversight in the original survey map was corrected. You're welcome to review the documents in our office. Archival oversight. Those two words bounced around my head for days. I dug through every folder I had. My grandfather kept everything. Property deeds, tax records, even a hand-drawn map of the orchard from 1961. It had pencil smudges and a coffee ring on the corner, but it clearly showed where our land ended. And the new fence? It was a good 10 feet into our side. That was no adjustment. That was theft with a fancy title. When I marched into the HOA office, binder in hand, I thought maybe, just maybe, someone would listen. The receptionist looked over her glasses like I was a dog tracking mud on the carpet. She told me the board wasn't available, but that I could schedule a statement period for next month's meeting. I asked if the fence would be coming. Down in the meantime. She just smiled and said, "That's unlikely, sir." That word again. Sir. Always polite, always condescending. I went to that meeting anyway. Sat in a plastic chair for an hour while they discussed mailbox uniformity and whether someone's Halloween decorations had violated aesthetic cohesion. When it was finally my turn, I laid out everything. The documents, the photos, the absurdity of fencing off a living, growing orchard like it was an empty plot of land. They listened in silence. And when I finished, the president of the HOA, a man with perfectly parted hair and a voice like a disappointed principal, thanked me for my emotional investment, but reiterated that the adjustment had been legally processed. They knew. They'd planned it. And they didn't care. I walked out of that room angrier than I'd been in years. I looked at that fence every morning after that like it was mocking me. It sliced through my orchard like a knife through pie, indifferent to the lives and roots it disrupted. Birds still flitted from tree to tree, of course. They didn't care. But me? I stood there every day like I'd lost something I didn't even know could be taken. Not just land, but legacy. See, my grandfather planted those trees by hand, every single one. When I was a kid, he used to lift me onto his shoulders during harvest season, so I could pluck the ones he couldn't reach anymore. He used to say, "Trees remember who waters them." I thought it was just a saying. But now, staring at half my orchard stolen behind bars, I realized what he meant. It wasn't just about apples. It was about care, about time, about ownership that runs deeper than deeds. And now, thanks to a line someone drew in a back room, they thought they could take all that from me. Like land only mattered when it was framed on a wall. But I wasn't done, not even close, because trees, unlike fences, don't stop growing. And they don't respect lines drawn in ink. I didn't know it yet, but that fence, the one they built to divide me from my trees, was about to become the best mistake they ever made. I protested. Of course, anyone would have. The next morning after the meeting, I went back to the HOA office with my binder clutched tight in one hand and my coffee in the other, steam curling up in the cold air. I wasn't ready to let this go. I had documents, real ones, signed by people who'd been buried for decades now, people whose names meant something when they were alive. I thought if I just showed them, really showed them, they'd see reason. Maybe they didn't understand what this orchard meant. Maybe they thought it was decorative. They probably assumed I planted it like some weekend hobby. They didn't understand it was blood and bone, but it turned out they understood perfectly well. They just didn't care. I met with a man named Brent. He wore a fleece vest over a golf shirt and had a tight little smile that never touched his eyes. He flipped through my binder like it was a restaurant menu he wasn't interested in. Occasionally, he'd make a non-committal sound, like or I see. But he didn't see. Not really. Not once did he meet my eyes. When he got to the hand-drawn map from 1961, the one with my grandfather's initials in the corner, he actually chuckled. "This isn't a legal document," he said, setting it aside like a napkin. "It's sweet, though. Sweet." That word hit harder than he probably meant it to. He went on to say that even if there were minor historical discrepancies, the updated boundary had already been registered with the county. Retroactive approvals, he called them. I asked him how that was possible without me signing anything. He said something about a clerical provision that allowed the HOA to act on behalf of the community in certain zoning disputes. I told him it wasn't a zoning dispute. It was my land. He shrugged. "You're welcome to appeal it legally," he said, finally looking up. "Though, just to be transparent, we've already confirmed everything with the HOA's legal team. It would be an expensive process." And there it was. The smirk behind the words. Not overt, but real. They knew exactly what they'd done. They'd built the fence fast, filed the paperwork faster, and dared me to stop them, because they knew I didn't have the money to drag this into court. Not while trying to keep the orchard going, keep the water lines clear, fix the tractor again, and pay property taxes that always came a little sooner than they should. So I walked out, binder still in my hand. My chest felt tight, not just from anger, but from something heavier, like grief. Not just for the land, but for the way it was taken, quietly, without a fight, just a signature on a form I never saw. And now, I was supposed to swallow it and move on. But then something strange happened. It started subtly. The first time I noticed, I thought I was imagining things. I was out walking the line of the orchard one morning, as I always did, checking for signs of fungus, insect trails, soil softness, all the things my grandfather taught me to look for. I paused by one of the trees nearest the fence. It was an old Cortland, strong and bent with time. A branch hung low, and its tip brushed just over the edge of the iron bars, and there, clear as day, were flower buds. New ones. A little early, for spring maybe, but healthy. I bent closer and realized the branch had twisted slightly, just enough to stretch through the bars. It had grown toward the light on the other side. It made sense, of course. Trees aren't patriotic. They don't wave flags or recognize borders. Roots spread where they can, water flows where it wants, and branches reach for the sun no matter what side of the fence it's on. But something about seeing that soft cluster of pink-white blossoms blooming on the wrong side, on their side, made my chest feel a little less tight. Over the next week, I noticed more. My trees weren't just touching the fence anymore. They were growing through it. Branches slipped between bars, leaves fluttered in the breeze on both sides. I saw bees landing on blossoms that had opened just outside the HOA's line. They didn't seem to care about the adjusted property map either. And then, in the first week of May, tiny green nubs appeared. Fruit. The apples were forming. It wasn't until June that it really hit me. The fence was no longer keeping my orchard in. It was supporting it. Like a trellis, unintentionally placed in the exact wrong place, at the exact right time. Some of my oldest trees had found a new way to thrive, wrapping their limbs across the bars, letting sunlight filter through as they stretched into territory they weren't supposed to have. It was as if the trees were saying, "Nice try." I started pruning differently that summer. I let certain branches grow in directions I usually wouldn't. I fed them well. Extra compost, deep watering, all the little rituals I'd learned over the years. I even started naming the branches that crossed the fence. Little Rebellion, I called one. Trespasser, another I nicknamed Amnesty. They grew strong, and they grew apples. By late summer, red and green fruit hung on both sides of the fence, and I made a point of taking walks with my coffee and admiring them. From their side, I never touched them, not yet. But I smiled when I saw them ripening there, in open defiance. The HOA noticed, of course. At first, they tried to pretend it wasn't happening. I saw a few members come by with their little clipboards and khakis, circling the fence, muttering. One woman even took pictures, maybe for their next newsletter. I kept waiting for a notice, one of those stern, vaguely threatening letters they love to send. But none came. Instead, a few weeks later, someone trimmed one of the branches that had reached the farthest. A clean cut, too neat to be the E. Wind. I found it lying on the ground, still heavy with unripe apples. That one hurt. But it also told me something important. I wasn't just imagining it. They were worried. They knew those apples didn't belong to them. Not really. They knew their fence had failed. Nature had ignored their line. My trees had ignored it. And, no matter how many documents they filed, no matter how carefully they crafted their language, the apples on the other side whispered something that no bureaucracy could silence. This land remembers who loves it. And it's not you. They tried everything to stop it. At first, it was subtle. I'd go out one morning and notice a few branches clipped, always the ones that reached furthest through the bars. Neat cuts, clean angles, done with a pair of sharp pruning shears. Not random, not nature. HOA hands. Probably done at night or early morning when no one was watching. I'd gather the cut branches and bring them inside like broken bones. The apples on them were always smaller, still growing, not yet ripe. I started leaving notes, little tags I tied to the remaining branches. Do not cut. These are mine. Then I didn't care. Next came the plastic shields. One afternoon I came back from the feed store and found clear, jagged panels zip-tied to the top of the fence, like anti-bird spikes, but meant to keep branches from crossing. They'd extended the height of the fence by another 2 feet, ugly and obvious. The sun caught them at certain angles and reflected light straight into my kitchen window, like an insult with glare. I stood there for a long time just looking at it, wondering what kind of people put up barriers against fruit. But the trees didn't care either. They kept growing. By late July, the apples had doubled in size. Bright reds, glossy greens, even a few golden ones. The branches had found ways around the shields, bent sideways, twisted up, and reached through any opening they could find. One especially bold limb from a Honeycrisp tree curled under the plastic and popped up like it was waving hello. The apples on that branch were massive, bigger than my hand. I named that one the General. Then the bees came. I'd read once that bees can fly miles to find the right flowers. Well, they found mine, on both sides of the fence. I watched them work, dancing from blossom to blossom, indifferent to who claimed the dirt beneath. It made me laugh, honestly. There I was, walking a property line someone else drew, while a dozen bees zipped back and forth like they didn't give a damn. I started leaving little saucers of water and sugar near the fence posts. If they were going to help me, I figured, I'd help them back. That was around the time people started noticing. It began with a few neighbors. I'd see them out on their evening walks, pausing near the fence, pointing at the apples. One woman even crouched down to take a photo. I pretended to be busy pulling weeds nearby, but I was listening. She said to her husband, "I didn't know the HOA planted trees here. They're gorgeous." I wanted to shout, "They didn't plant a damn thing." But I kept quiet. Let the trees do the talking, and talk they did. By the end of August, the apples were fully grown, ripe and heavy, some almost dragging their branches down under their own weight. That fence, that cold iron insult, had become a kind of orchard gallery, a living exhibit, apples glowing behind bars. People slowed down as they drove by. A kid on a bike stopped to reach through and grab one, and I didn't say a word. He took a bite and grinned. That was enough for me, but the real turning point came with the Harvest Festival. Every year, the HOA throws this overplanned, aggressively cheerful event in the community park. Booths, hay bales, cider, live music. That's just loud enough to ruin conversations. Usually I skip it, but this year they added something new. A produce table. Right there in the middle of the park, under a canvas tent, they'd arranged baskets of apples, red, green, yellow, all of them polished to a shine, some with little compliments of the HOA tags tied on with twine. And there, nestled among the pumpkins and gourds, were my apples, not just similar. Mine. I knew their shape, their color, the slight dimple in one of the Honeycrisps that only happened on the older trees. I walked over, picked one up, turned it in my hand. Even the scent was familiar, crisp and earthy, with that faint sweetness that hit right before you bit in. I looked up and saw Brent, fleece vest Brent, chatting with a couple of board members near the cider station. He noticed me, smiled. I walked straight up to the table. A woman nearby, maybe mid-30s, wearing a fall-in-love-with-autumn hoodie, saw me eyeing the fruit. "Aren't these amazing?" she said. "I heard the HOA started a mini orchard." "Program. Isn't that neat?" I laughed. I couldn't help it, just one short, sharp laugh. "They didn't grow these," I said. "I did." She looked confused. "Oh?" "They're from my trees, on my land. They just happened to grow through their fence." And then I raised my voice, just enough to cut through the fiddle music in the background. These apples came from trees the HOA tried to cut off from their own roots. A few people turned. Brent's smile faded. I didn't make a scene. I didn't throw anything or shout. I just placed the apple back into the basket, tipped my hat, and walked away. That night, someone posted a picture of the apple table on the community app. Tagged me in the comments. "Didn't know you were supplying the HOA produce now, neighbor. That's some generous fruit sharing." I replied simply, "Wasn't voluntary." The post went viral, at least locally. A friend of mine who works for a small-town paper got wind of it. Called me up for a quote. The article came out 2 days later. "Man grows apples across the fence of HOA that took his orchard." It was a hit. Someone shared it on Facebook. Then came the memes. One had a photo of the fence with the caption, "When you build a wall but forget trees don't care." And suddenly, my quiet little orchard wasn't so quiet anymore. People started coming by just to see it. Some knocked on my door and asked if they could take photos. A few offered to buy apples. I gave most of them away. I liked the idea of people enjoying something that came from a place the HOA had tried to steal. One teenager even brought his girlfriend over and proposed in front of the fence. I told him if she said yes, he could have a whole bushel for free. She did. They left with 2. The HOA, of course, wasn't pleased. I got a letter a week later. Some vague language about unauthorized agricultural expansion and a review of acceptable landscape integration. I framed it, hung it in the kitchen above the sink. Every time I washed my hands, I looked at it and smiled. Because by then, the truth had rooted itself deeper than any ordinance could reach. The apples on that fence weren't just fruit. They were defiance, resilience, and quiet revenge. I hadn't lifted a weapon, hadn't gone to court, hadn't even touched a single leaf on their side of the fence. I'd simply let nature do what it does best: grow, reach, reclaim, and no amount of plastic, pruning, or paperwork could stop it. Fall rolled in slow that year, as if the world itself wanted to linger in the warmth of what had happened. The orchard glowed in the late-season sun, every leaf a flicker of red, gold, or orange. It looked like fire had swept through and left only beauty behind. The apples hung heavy on the branches, and not just on my side. By now the fence had practically disappeared under the weight of limbs, fruit, and curling vines. Nature had wrapped itself around the HOA's little wall like a mother hugging a scared child, patient, unstoppable, forgiving in its own way. The story kept spreading. First it was the local paper, then it got picked up by a regional news station. They sent a reporter in a blazer 2 sizes too big and a cameraman who kept swatting at bees. They interviewed me under the oldest apple tree on my property, the same one I used to climb when I was too small to reach the branches from the ground. I told them the truth. I didn't dramatize it, didn't spin it. I said, they tried to cut me off from what's always been mine. But trees don't understand. Fences, they grow where they're loved. That quote ended up in the headline, "They grow where they're loved." And just like that, the fence became something else. Not a wall, not a line, but a symbol. People came from other towns, even other states. Some brought their own stories about HOAs, greedy developers, neighbors with more money than sense. One man from Utah told me about a community garden that got bulldozed because it didn't match the visual standards of the neighborhood. Another woman from Georgia said her HOA fined her for hanging a wind chime because it generated unregulated sound. But then they saw my apples, growing, thriving in absolute defiance, and they smiled. They understood. By October, the HOA tried to shift the narrative. They posted a statement online, something stiff and bureaucratic, claiming that the fence had been installed in accordance with updated community land records, and that the apple growth represented a beautiful example of neighborly cooperation. I laughed out loud when I read that. Cooperation? I hadn't even been invited to the meeting where they stole the land. But now that the apples were famous, now that their side of the fence was sweet with fruit, they wanted to act like it had been their idea all along. So I gave them a gift. I left a basket of apples at the HOA office door, right under their brass nameplate. No note, just a basket. Every one of those apples had grown on branches that had crossed the line. They were flawless, big, juicy, with color that practically glowed. I polished each one myself. People in the office must have seen them. By noon, the basket was gone. A week later, they emailed me. Not a legal notice this time, not a complaint, an invitation. They wanted to partner on a community orchard initiative. Something about encouraging natural growth, celebrating shared green spaces. They offered to sponsor new trees, said they'd even fund a composting program if I consulted. Brent himself, fleece vest and all, signed the message. I didn't even reply. Not at first. I printed the email, folded it neatly, and used it to level the leg of my old workshop table where the floor dips. I wasn't angry anymore, not even bitter. I'd won, and not in a way they could measure, because what they didn't realize is that the apples had never really been about fruit. They were about time, about memory, about my grandfather's cracked hands lifting me into branches, about my mother sitting on the back porch with a basket in her lap, peeling skins into one long curling ribbon, about the seasons that had come and gone without asking anyone's permission. The fence didn't stop any of that. It couldn't. It had only sharpened my focus, reminded me that what mattered couldn't be surveyed, signed away, or wrapped in red tape, and the trees kept growing. That winter was mild, but the orchard slept all the same. Snow dusted the fence like powdered sugar. The branches went bare, but the shape of them remained, reaching, stretching, crossing the line like they'd always meant to. I pruned in silence that year, no music, just my breath and the crisp snap of shears. The roots beneath the soil were deeper than ever. Spring returned with a vengeance. By April, the blossoms came back in thick clusters. They covered the fence like lace, like confetti, like nature was throwing a party and forgot to tell the HOA it wasn't invited. Bees returned in buzzing droves. Birds nested in the crooks of limbs that bent over the iron bars. The fence itself had begun to bend slightly, warped by the weight of branches and the push of roots underneath. It wasn't just a wall anymore. It was infrastructure for something much older and stronger. Kids came with their parents to see the magic fence. That's what someone had started calling it online. They'd reach through the bars, touch the blossoms gently, ask questions about the trees. One girl with freckles and pink boots looked up at me and asked, "Do they know they're not supposed to grow here?" I crouched down and told her the truth. They don't care where people say they're allowed to grow. They just reach for the sun. Her parents took a photo. She's probably still got it, framed somewhere. Then one morning, in late May, I noticed something new. A seedling. Tiny, no taller than my shin, growing right up against the base of the fence on the HOA's side. It hadn't been planted. It had arrived. A gift from a wind-blown seed, dropped by a bird or carried on the breeze. I knelt beside it, brushed the soil gently around its roots. Healthy, young, strong. It looked like a Fuji. I didn't tell anyone about it. Not even the neighbors I liked. I just visited it every day, checking its progress, watering it quietly at dawn. I knew the HOA would probably try to remove it once it got big enough to notice. But maybe, just maybe, they wouldn't. Maybe someone would recognize that it had earned its place. Not because of paperwork, but because it was meant to be there. That fall, the apples returned. More than ever. The fence sagged under the weight, and I let it. Because by then, everyone in town knew the truth. The fence they built to divide me from my orchard had become a shrine to persistence, a living sculpture, a line they drew, and nature crossed without hesitation. One night in October, after a long day of harvesting, I sat on my back porch with a slice of apple pie and a glass of bourbon. The wind was soft, the stars were out, and the fence was glowing in the moonlight. Covered in leaves and fruit, not a single bar visible anymore. Just branches, life, legacy. I raised my glass toward it. To my grandfather, I whispered. To stubborn roots, and to every apple that grows on the wrong side of the fence. And somewhere, I swear I heard the trees rustle back.